Hello everyone. So now we are on the last module for this course, the fourth module, and like I mentioned in module 3 that in this module, in the fourth module, we will be talking about macroeconomic policies and how these macroeconomic policies could be used for correcting any kind of recessionary pressure in the economy. However, in order to understand how macroeconomic policies work, we must first understand the demand and supply model in the context of the macroeconomy. Now please note that in module 2 we have covered the demand and supply model that works for the microeconomy. Now the difference between micro and macro, I will come to that in a minute, but please understand the basic difference between module 2 and module 4. In module 2 we were talking about demand and supply in the context of microeconomics. In module 4 we are going to talk about the same demand and supply but in the context of the macroeconomy, and then we are going to use this macroeconomic demand and supply model to understand the working of the macroeconomic policies. Now demand and supply model in the context of the macroeconomy is known as the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply model. The basic difference between micro and macro, let's talk about that. Now if you remember, in microeconomics when we talked about demand and supply, we were talking about the market for one particular commodity, right? We were looking at the market price and the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied of that one commodity. It could be ice cream, it could be textbook, it could be apples, oranges, anything, right? In the macroeconomy, we cannot pick one particular commodity, but we are looking at the production of all final goods and services produced in the economy during a year. So I'm not picking a particular good or I'm not picking a particular service, but we are talking about all commodities and all services that are produced during the accounting period, which is 1 year. Right. So that means you can understand here I cannot look at in the macroeconomic demand and supply model, I really cannot identify the quantity of which good am I looking at or the quantity of which service am I looking at, because there is no good or service to pick out, it's the entire volume. So I am basically looking at the quantity of all goods and services produced in the economy, and similarly I cannot really identify the price of which good or service to look at. Instead I have to find some indicator of the average prices or the aggregate prices in the economy, because I cannot cherry pick one. I cannot say okay, I'm going to look at the price of apples or I'm going to look at the price of steel, right? I cannot do that. Instead I have to find something which indicates the average price level in the economy during an accounting period. And just to refresh your memory, if you remember, we kind of touched upon this in module 3 unit 1, where we were talking about nominal GDP, real GDP, and we said that the ratio of nominal and real GDP gives you the GDP deflator, and that GDP deflator is basically a price index. It is an indicator of the average prices in the economy, right? So that is what we are going to use here in module 4 when we talk about demand and supply in the macro context. So that means if I am going to draw a two-dimensional graph for the macroeconomy, then please understand that here on the x-axis I cannot put the quantity of any particular good or service. Instead, it is the total quantity of all final goods and services produced in the economy. Now every time I say that the total volume of all final goods and services, by now it should ring a bell that we are actually talking about the GDP, because the GDP is defined as the total volume of all goods and services produced in an economy, right? So that should be the GDP, and since the price adjusted GDP is the real GDP, so basically on the x-axis we are going to take real GDP. Similarly here we cannot take the dollar price of any commodity, instead we should take an indicator of average prices of commodities and services in the economy, so that should be the GDP deflator, and the GDP deflator is still denoted as capital P, but please note that this capital P is not P own, so it is not the own price of any commodity, rather it is an index. So that means it is not a dollar value, it's not related to any currency, rather it's just a real number. Okay, so that's the basic difference. Here you have real GDP, so that is in terms of dollars or any other currency, but this is not in terms of dollars, this is just a real number. That's the basic difference between the macro and the micro diagram. In case of microeconomics, your x-axis had quantity and that was units of the commodity, right? Whatever, it could be pounds, it could be, baskets, or it could be kilograms, whatever, unit of quantity. Whereas on the x-axis you had P own, and that P own was in terms of dollars or a currency. And this was the market for some commodity X, apples or ice creams or textbooks, whatever, right, or a service. But here you cannot identify any service. This is the diagram for the entire macroeconomy where you are looking at all goods and services produced in the economy. Now in the next video we are going to first look at aggregate demand in isolation, then we are going to move to aggregate supply, look at that in isolation, and then bring the AD and AS together and look at the macroeconomic diagram for aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So that's what we are going to do in this module. And then in unit 2 of module 4 we will move on to the macroeconomic policies.